Hello everyone. Tonight we will walk through streets that no longer exist, where the aroma of fresh bread was a desired ghost, and the silence of hunger echo on the stones.
Maybe you are lying down right now, with your head on the pillow, listening to the distant sound of the city sleeping.
Outside, artificial lights flicker and the sounds of modernity disguise themselves as calm. But this story takes us to another time, where the loudest noise was the empty stomach.
Paris, 1789.
A city of contrasts where hunger did not ask for permission.
Where the smell of distant bread could both comfort and drive you crazy. The heat of the oven was a privilege of those who could afford it, and most only dreamed. This is a story about stomachs.
About what happens when the body begs, but the world is silent.
If your mind is restless, perhaps you will find peace on this journey. A peace that is born of understanding and empathy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to me from now? And what time is it there?
Imagine waking up to the first sound of the street, a wooden cart creaking, someone coughing in the distance.
Your mattress is made of crushed straw.
Your feet touch the cold, damp ground, and your stomach is already screaming, even before daylight.
Your last meal was 2 days ago.
A bland soup, more water than sustenance.
Outside, Paris wakes up covered in smoke and ash.
The bakeries are still asleep, or pretending to be asleep, as a way of protecting themselves. You walk through the alleys with your eyes downcast.
The alleys smell of old sweat, of forgotten grease.
And with each step, your body grows heavier.
Not from exhaustion, but from emptiness.
It's as if the air tastes of waiting for a bread that may never come.
You ask yourself, how many more days?
How many mornings like this?
Hunger in that Paris was not an event. It was the landscape. It was what filled the absences.
France, at that time, was still, officially, a kingdom of abundance. But abundance for whom?
In the palaces, the gardens bloomed and the halls clinked with silver spoons. In the streets, the people clinked to with bones rattling under their skin.
And there was something cruel in the contrast between the smells. The perfume coming from Versailles, made of flowers and banquet.
And the bittersweet aroma of bread being baked, somewhere that was not meant for you. Bread, at that time, was not just food. It was symbol. It was hope. It was also revolt. The smell of bread was so powerful that it could be proof of betrayal.
Or a miracle.
Or sin.
It depended on who smelled it.
If you close your eyes now, you might be able to feel it too. The sound of the old city. The creaking of carts. The rustling of clothes drying between crooked windows.
The uneven pavement beneath your feet. And in the background, like a collective memory, the smell of bread that never arrives.
It's curious to think how our sense of smell connects us to history. How a smell can awaken an entire era. In that Paris of 1789, many people went to sleep dreaming of bakeries.
Others woke up crying because they hadn't managed to steal even a crumb.
The city smelled of waiting.
Waiting for food. Waiting for justice. Waiting for an end that never came.
And between one corner and another, the question, could today be the day we die of hunger? It was common to say, on the streets, that hunger made people see ghosts. And perhaps it did.
Children saw fruit in the shadows. Women swore they could taste an invisible broth.
Men chewed memories. When the stomach is empty, the brain fills it with what it can.
Dreams, delusions, memories. And there was something poetic yet cruel in this effort.
The mind trying to protect the body.
As if to say, I know there is no food, but I can still give you an image. I can still offer you an idea of bread. A warm idea. It burns a little inside, but it calms you down.
And so the people went on.
From crumb to crumb. From hallucination to hallucination.
Until one day,
the silence exploded in screams.
But this story
doesn't begin with screams. It begins with sighs.
With loud eyes. With the ragged breathing of someone chewing on nothing.
It begins with a woman heating water, hoping the steam will fool her son. With an old man who keeps a brand in his pocket as if it were a jewel. With a girl who draws bread on the ground with a piece of coal. That was how the people lived. And sometimes that was how they died. In silence. In waiting. In hope. Hope that the oven would open. That the baker would have compassion. That the line would move.
That there would be a line at least. It wasn't always like that.
But it was like that enough to shake the soul of a people. If this story has started to touch you, well, there's plenty more where that came from. And there's no need to rush. I'll be here.
Whenever you want to come back. Whenever you feel like walking slowly through other nights of the past. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan to create that soft hum in the background.
Or leave a window ajar, so the night wind will accompany. Let's begin this journey together.
For the hunger that became fire. For the bread that became flag. for the pain that became history, and for the silence
that still echoes in every forgotten crumb.
On paper, France was one of the richest countries in the world. Maps of the time painted it in golden colors, flanked by fertile fields and lively cities. Travelers wrote of the elegance of the royal garden, of the fountains that danced between marble sculptures. Versailles itself seemed like a planet apart, shining, fragrant, pulsating with excess. But beyond the palace walls, there was another reality, as vast as it was silent. The abundance did not reach the faces bent over in the fields. It did not touch the dirty fingers that sowed the soil. The shine of gold covered holes. Holes in the grain, holes in the dishes, holes in the promises. France was technically an agricultural power, but it was a power that did not eat. Wheat did grow, yes, but it did not grow for everyone. Much of the production was destined for the nobles, for taxes, for tithes. And what was left? It was sold at prices that the people could not afford. In times of crisis, speculation took over the markets. Merchants stored stocks, waiting for prices to rise, and they did, penny by penny. Each increase became a sentence. Famine, at that time, was not only biological. It was engineered, a product of mismanagement, greed, and neglect, a scarcity manufactured by human hands. Perhaps the cruelest thing was the contrast. All you had to do was cross a street, leave a village, cross a bridge, and reality changed. On one side, maids served coffee with cream and buttered bread. On the other, mothers heated cloths to pretend they were food. It was an abundance made of closed shop windows, of unattainable smells, of carriages that passed quickly, as if they ignored the world around them. And they ignored it, because, for those who lived on banquets, hunger was a legend, a distant rumor, something that was fought with occasional charity, with arms thrown like someone throwing crumbs to pigeons. But the people were not pigeons. They were people, and he was beginning to realize it. In the fields, the land felt it too. Abandoned, exploited, exhausted, without investment, without care, without return. The peasants plowed the land with their bare hands. They harvested what they could, but part of what they harvested had already been destined for the feudal lord, the church tithe, the king's tax. There was little left, almost nothing, and even that almost nothing was sometimes taken by force. Soldiers came to collect the grain. They collected the coins, and the silence that followed was heavier than the harvest. The land, once a symbol of life, became a prison. Agriculture was abundant, yes, but hunger, even more abundant. Versailles, on the other hand, shone. Its gardens were pruned with mathematical precision. The flowers were changed every season, as if time could be controlled by aesthetic. Fountains gushed day and night. Ballrooms echoed with music. Dresses danced in calculated twirls. And the banquets. Oh, the banquets. They weren't just meals. They were spectacle. They were dishes that took hours to prepare. Rare ingredients. Birds stuffed with other birds. Sauces that only existed there. All this while, a few kilometers away, the people chewed hope. Hope that one day this luxury would slip away. That a crumb would fall. That a gesture of humanity would blossom. But there was also an invisible hunger. A hunger for meaning. For justice. For coherence. Because it wasn't just the stomach that hurt. It was the mind, the spirit, dignity. How do you explain to your child that there are fields of wheat everywhere, but no bread? How do you understand that food exists, but it's not yours? That someone has decided you're not worthy of it? That was the deepest wound. The illusion of abundance was crueler than the real absence, because it made it seem like it was your fault. That maybe you weren't trying hard enough. That maybe you didn't deserve it. And it was that illusion that was starting to crumble. If this story is making you think, feel free to continue with us. There is no rush. I will be here whenever you want to walk these streets of the past again. Now, take a deep breath. Remember that this is just the beginning, and that the next scenes will bring even more silences to be heard. If you can, share in the comments what the weather is like outside. Is it raining? Is it cold? What do you feel when you imagine these silent fields? Let's continue together on this unhurried journey. There was a time when a loaf of bread was worth more than promises. A time when the currency of exchange was the stomach, and justice fluctuated according to the price of flour. Imagine walking down an old street, between stone building, listening to the sound of your own footsteps. The cold is slight, but persistent. You see a line in front of a bakery, and you smell it. A warm, earthy, enveloping aroma. But it is a smell that causes more pain than comfort, because you know you will not go in. The price of a loaf of bread in that revolutionary Paris was more than money. It was a measure of despair, of anguish, and for many of the end. The coins in her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from indecision. Buying a loaf of bread meant not buying firewood, or soap, or medicine. Every extra cent in the price was a push toward the abyss.
And the increases came silently, like footsteps in the snow.
One day it was 2 sous, then 4,
Then 7.
and suddenly the bread cost an entire week's work.
It wasn't a luxury. It was an insult, a reminder that life had a price.
And that price wasn't yours to control. It was decided in distant halls,
By voices that had never felt hunger.
not even in their dreams. The pamphlets that circulated in the streets spoke of this.
They spoke of bread as a symbol, as a flag, as freedom. The people cried out for bread before they cried out for a republic. Because before any political system, there was the body.
And the body cried out for sustenance. The pamphlets were handwritten in dark ink on rough paper. Some said, freedom is being able to buy bread without fear.
Others said, if there is wheat, why is there no bread?
Words spread like crumbs in the wind.
And each one of them touched a hungry soul.
Each sentence was an echo of what everyone already knew, but was afraid to say out loud. The smell of freshly baked bread was perhaps the most dangerous aroma in Paris, because it awakened something primal, an uncontrollable desire, a reminder of what it means to be human, and when that desire could not be satisfied.
It turned into anger.
Resentment, a revolt that arose in the nostril. It was not uncommon to see crowds gathering in front of bakeries, not to buy,
But to observe, to protest in silence, to make their presence felt.
It was like a dark ritual, a theater of hunger, and bakers sometimes became targets, not out of personal malice,
But because they represented a system that denied the essential. Some stories tell of mothers who would take their children to the bakery board just so they could smell it. A gesture of crooked love, but still love.
It was all they could give. Others tell of people carrying empty bags just to pretend they bought something, a show against shame, against the judgment of their neighbors.
And there were those who, after fasting so much, could no longer smell it. The body got used to it. It became numb,
And the world was beginning to seem like a pale scene, without aroma.
without flavor, without color. Bread, in these cases, was memory.
And memory did not fill the stomach.
Some say the revolution began with words, others with gunshots. But perhaps it really began with prices, with numbers written on blackboard.
with pennies that accumulated until they exploded.
It was as if each increase in the price of bread was a nail in the coffin of the monarchy.
And the people, already powerless, found a voice.
A voice in the lines, a voice in the pamphlets, a voice in the alleys. The indignation was not abstract.
It was concrete. It had the shape of bread. It had a smell. And it had weight.
And it was this weight that pushed a sleeping nation into the streets,
Not in search of ideals, but of sustenance.
If you've made it this far, you may have already realized that this story is not just about the past,
It's about us. About what we value. About what we call essential.
and about how we measure someone's dignity.
If all this touched you in any way, I'll be here whenever you want to continue. Now, if you want, share with me. What was the most unforgettable smell from your childhood? And what would it be like to live in a world where that smell was forbidden?
Take a deep breath.
The next chapter awaits us, with more echoes than you could possibly buy. Hunger has a sound,
But it's not what you imagine. It's not a scream.
nor a plea.
It's more subtle, more intimate.
It's the sound of a stomach contracting in the silence of the night. The sound of an empty spoon hitting the bottom of a clean pan. The creaking of the stomach blending with the creaking of the bed.
Going to bed hungry was an imposed habit, a routine that repeated itself like the tolling of bells. And in 1789 in Paris, this sound echoed through entire alleys. In damp rooms, mothers pretended to sleep before their children.
So they wouldn't have to explain why dinner was all silent. And silence, there, hurt. The alleys of Paris smelled of wet stone, of bodies pressed together, of old sweat.
But at night, what was felt most was absent.
Absence of stove smoke. Absence of dishes being washed. Absence of laughter. The city slept hungry. And if you walked late at night, you might hear a muffled cry.
A sob that didn't want to be noticed. There wasn't much to do.
Nor anywhere to go. Hunger wasn't a visitor. It was a resident. As constant as the cold breeze that blew through the cracks in the windows. Hunger slept next door.
And sometimes it was the only company.
Some women developed tactics to delay despair. They boiled water with a piece of bark, just to fill the house with steam.
So that their children would feel that something was being done.
It was a theatre.
But a theatre of love.
Others told stories before bed.
Stories about fairies who brought enchanted bread. About islands where everything.
These stories did not fill the stomach.
But they filled the time.
And time in that condition was something to be overcome.
Hour by hour.
In the dark, between tense breaths, each minute passed slowly, as if mocking the wait,
There were also those who slept standing up.
leaning against walls.
afraid to lie down and not wake up.
The weakness made the body lose control. The mind jumbled dates,
Names, sensations, and little by little, the world became hazy.
as if reality was being forgotten inside.
Some homeless people talked to themselves.
Others laughed at jokes that no one heard, and many just kept quiet. Silence was a protection. Sleeping hungry was not only difficult, it was dangerous, because sleep sometimes came as a surrender, and the line between resting and disappearing was thin. Those who managed to get some rest dreamed. They dreamed of tables full of food,
Of hands that offered bread without charge.
of homes where food was a right, not an achievement.
But when they woke up, there was emptiness, the same wall, the same cold floor,
The same feeling that the world was wrong.
that something essential had broken.
And every morning, the body tried to react, with slow movements, with short steps, with lowered gazes. It was a cycle,
Eating a little, fasting for days,
sleeping badly,
waking up more tired, and still,
carrying on.
because not carrying on was worse.
There were those who got used to it, or thought they did. The body, even though fragile, created defenses.
The eyes lost their shine, but gained a kind of resistance.
The heart beat slowly, but steadily.
It was a way of survival.
An adaptation, but it wasn't life. It was resistance.
And resistance, at that time, was a political act.
Even if silent, even if invisible, each night spent without food was a small victory.
An affirmation of existence.
And that, despite everything, there was still a possible tomorrow, even if small, even if distant,
If you are still here, perhaps you feel this journey too,
not as pain,
but as memory.
a borrowed memory.
That is not yours, but can be felt. If this story is moving you, continue. I will be close by, like a candlelit next to the bed.
Like a soft sound in the room.
And if you want, share with me. Have you ever heard the sound of your own silence?
Let's go together. There is still a long way to go on these streets of echo and waiting.
Falling the stomach was a science without book.
An alchemy of survival. When there was no food, people invented it, not as an art, but as a matter of urgency. The kitchens of the poorest were not places of abundance.
They were spaces of tricks, pots with more water than substance, spoons that stirred nothing with hope.
The famous stone soup, which many think is just a metaphor, was real.
A clean stone, placed in boiling water.
The steam rose, and with it, an illusion. Children concentrated on the movement of the water and imagined flavors.
As if desire could season.
There were those who used nettles, other herbs considered weeds.
Crushed, boiled, sifted, diluted to the point that they disappeared into the broth.
The taste was bitter, but there was heat, and heat was often enough. Others cooked rags, boiled cotton cloths, chewed as if they were meat. It was dangerous.
But there was little to lose. The body no longer responded to the same warnings, and the mind,
Got used to it. Chewing became a symbol of resistance.
as if the act in itself could nourish. Eating was a ritual.
And like all rituals, it involved faith.
In some homes, leftover corn cobs were kept as relics, reused countless times,
Scraped with a knife, then cooked again, until there was nothing left.
no color,
No texture.
just the idea of food.
It was common to hear stories of families who shared a single loaf of stale bread for days,
Soaked in water, cut into invisible pieces.
each bite an eternity, each crumb a celebration. The stomach knew it was not enough,
But the heart,
pretended to believe.
and deep down, maybe that was what sustained it.
Some used diluted ink to color the broths. The color gave a sense of body, of prison. Even if the flavor didn't match, there was also mold, scraped from forgotten corners.
Fermented with urine, in desperate attempts to create something that resembled bread.
It was repulsive, but it was what they had. And even these extreme methods were shared with care,
With instructions passed down by word of mouth.
from generation to generation, as if, in the midst of famine, there was still room for tradition.
A sad tradition.
But tradition nonetheless.
The people became alchemists. They invented textures.
They created flavors with words. In some places, women sang while they cooked nothing. The song gave volume to the void, as if the sound could fill the pot. It was a kind of magic.
A sung hope. Children learned early on to wait,
To chew slowly,
to pretend to be full.
and in this pretense, they developed resistance. Hunger stopped being a moment,
It became a condition, a constant backdrop.
and the art of falling the stomach, paradoxically, kept many alive. Recipes could be found written down in stained notebook. Recipes without ingredients.
Or with symbolic ingredients.
A pinch of silence.
A spoonful of patience. A handful of memory. These notes were not meant to feed the body,
But the soul,
they were memories of times when eating was common.
and dreams of times when it would be again. Keeping these recipes was an act of faith, a silent declaration that hunger would one day end, and that when that day came, everyone would once again know what to do with a full pot. If you are listening to this while lying down, you may now feel the power of these small inventions, not as curiosity,
but as testament. If you want, share in the comments. What is the simplest food that has ever brought you comfort? The one that, even though small, embraced you inside.
I will be here, always,
To remember with you these stories that are not in books,
but live in empty pots.
and in hearts that still know how to imagine flavor.
There were days when Paris woke up silent. The sun rose as always, but the air seemed still. The streets that had once vibrated with the sounds of carts and street vendors were now empty.
It was as if the city had held its breath.
The markets, so lively and chaotic, simply disappeared, without warning, without a sign. Where there had once been baskets of vegetables, pieces of meat, barrels of cheap wine, there was now only ground and silence. A silence that seemed to scream. For the people, this was nothing new.
They were learning to read the invisible.
They knew that if the market had disappeared, fear was close by, and hunger even closer. The popular markets were places of survival,
But also of risk.
where there was exchange, there was espionage.
Guards infiltrated the vendors, listening, taking notes, waiting for a wrong word. Any criticism of the crown, any complaint about the price of bread.
All it took was a dirty look, and the merchant disappeared, arrested, or worse.
That's why, when the markets disappeared, the people didn't ask why. They just lamented.
They gathered their empty baskets and went home,
Or they went further, to the outskirts of the city.
where, perhaps, someone would have the courage to sell an onion in exchange for silence. Without a market, there was no smell, and that was missing. The smells of the markets were a sign of life,
Of fermentation, of food in motion.
There was the smell of fresh fish, of still wet lettuce leaves, of warm bread, of crushed garlic, and suddenly, all of that was lost.
The absence of smell was like morning,
A city without smell was a city without a pulse,
and the absence was as felt as hunger,
maybe even more.
because you could touch the aroma, but it fed you. At least it fed you hope.
When it disappeared, the emptiness was deeper. The sound was different too.
With no market, there were no overlapping voices,
No shouts of prices, no nervous laughter.
no clink of coins. It was as if the city had been wrapped in cotton wool,
Everything was muffled, everything was contained.
and in that silence, tension spread.
A collective fear, without a name,
No one knew if the markets would return tomorrow, or next week,
or ever. It was a wait with no prediction.
and during that wait, many went hungry.
Others took risks.
They went to hidden alleys, looking for some clandestine stall, a piece of cheese, a withered apple, anything.
The repression was real,
Officials forcibly closed stalls. They confiscated produce.
and sometimes they beat vendors.
It was said that free markets fostered unrest, that dangerous ideas were born there. The truth is that despair was born there. And despair, when shared, turned into unity.
That was what the government feared. The market was more than a place to shop,
It was a place to meet.
to talk, to show solidarity. And when all that was taken away, people felt that something essential had been broken. Not just the right to eat, but the right to be together.
And there were days when the fair returned, as if nothing had happened.
The stalls appeared again, colourful and improvised. The vendors with cautious smiles.
The fruits slightly older. The prices a little higher. But still, people ran.
They bought, they smelled.
They touched, as if that moment were unique. As if the fair were a brief miracle.
A breath of fresh air in the midst of asphyxiation.
Because they knew that, at any moment, everything could disappear again.
And so, the routine was made between presences and absences.
Between everything and nothing.
If you are listening to this now, perhaps you feel the weight of this coming and going, this constant instability.
Of a city that hides its own markets for fear of its people.
And if this image touched you, tell me, have you ever been to a place that seemed to breathe with you? I will be here, while the markets come and go.
While history whispers of stalls that are set up in silence. Let's keep going. There is still more to discover. They did not carry swords. They did not have titles. They did not make fiery speeches in assemblies. But they carried in their wounds what the revolution needed most: courage.
In Paris, in 1789, when famine arrived like an unabated wave, it was women who stood up first, not out of ideology, but out of instinct, out of necessity.
Their children's bellies dictated their steps, and these steps led to the center of power.
They were washerwomen, seamstresses, street vendors, women with calloused hands.
With sunken eyes, but with souls on fire.
They walked together, singing, carrying empty pots like flags.
The march to Versailles began like this.
With contained anger and determined steps. It was October,
The cold was already beginning to bite their skin.
and yet they went. Kilometers on foot, many barefoot, many without knowing if they would return. They carried in their bodies the memory of absence,
Of milk that dried up,
of bread that never arrived.
and each step was a soundless cry, a message to the king. They wanted flour, but they also wanted to be seen. The invisible in their lives needed to occupy the space of the halls,
And when they arrived, they were feared.
not because of their physical strength, but because of their symbolic strength. They were the people in the raw.
On the march, some carried children, others kitchen tools.
It was as if they were saying, "This is our weapon,"
The spoon, the pan, hunger, the cold.
and at the same time, each other's warmth. They formed a mass united by necessity.
There was no leader. There was rhythm, an invisible beat that guided their bodies.
They sang old songs,
Adapted verses.
laments transformed into melody.
The music warmed them.
It gave them meaning. It made the pain less.
And at the same time, it reminded them that they were not alone, that their pain was collective.
And therefore powerful.
As they marched, the city watched. Some applauded, others hid, many just watched in silence. They felt ashamed, or proud,
Or afraid.
but they knew something was changing, that this procession was not like the others.
It was not religious.
It was visceral, a break from everyday life, a rupture. When they reached the palace, they demanded food, and shelter, and respect, and the presence of the king in Paris.
And they got it, because the strength of those women was impossible to ignore.
Not because of their volume, but because of their truth. After that,
They returned to the streets,
to the alleys, to the cold houses.
but they were no longer the same.
They had seen the center. They had been heard.
And even though the hunger had not ended, something had changed.
The people, previously silent, now had voices.
And many of those voices came from women. They continued to lead,
In the lines for bread, in the protests for justice, in the silent vigils.
because they knew that the true revolution did not happen only in the squares. It also happened in the cribs.
In the cauldrons, in the lullabies that tried to console the emptiness. It was common to hear stories of women who exchanged their own pieces of bread to feed their neighbors, who shared what little they had without hesitation.
Who comforted other mothers with gentle words.
Even when they were hungry, they cultivated care, and in this care there was a revolution, the revolution of affection, of empathy, of insistence.
Because loving in a time of scarcity is also a political act. And they loved,
With their gaze,
with their touch,
with their presence,
and with their absence. When they were taken away,
arrested, killed, still,
they loved.
and left marks.
If this part of the story touched you, know that it lives on.
In the women who today also resist, in the mothers who face difficult days, in the voices that remain strong.
If you want, tell me in the comments, who is the strongest woman you have ever met?
And what did she teach you? Even without words, I will be here.
To listen, and to continue telling these stories that, even without a sword, changed the world.
The bread that was once a symbol of life began to carry the smell of fear. The bakeries that once welcomed laughter and exchanges became targets of fury and despair. The lines were no longer calm. They became guarded, tense, ready to explode. With each batch, a core choice was made. Who receives?
Who waits?
Who goes home empty-handed?
And on their faces, the same unspoken question. Why do they have it, and I don't?
The smell of warm bread, which once soothed, became a fuse. That golden aroma in the air announced not only sustenance, but also inequality. And inequality, when it ferments, turns into anger.
Many bakers began to live in fear.
Some were guilty of speculation. They hoarded flour to sell at a higher price.
Others were simply trying to survive amidst the chaos.
But the people, starving, made no distinction. A rumor was enough. It was said that a certain baker was hiding sacks of wheat,
That he charged certain families more. That he sold to nobles while the people were fasting.
and the rumor became a sentence. All it took was a hot afternoon, a sidelong glance, and the bakery became a target. The doors were broken down, the ovens were ransacked, the bread was fought over like treasure, and the baker disappeared. Some were lynched in public squares.
Others were hanged from improvised posts. The flour that once symbolized nourishment now covered the ground like dust from war. The hands that once kneaded dough now trembled when opening doors.
It was a time when cooking could be dangerous.
And selling bread, a risky choice. Many began closing early, or selling through the back door.
In hiding, with passwords.
With precaution,
Others fled.
they left their ovens behind. Abandoned bakeries became fresh ruins, makeshift memorials to the collapse of everyday life. The people did not want blood, they wanted justice. But when hunger takes over, justice loses its shape. It becomes blurred.
And the line between right and revenge is blurred. In some neighborhoods, groups began to organize lists.
They named who deserved the bread, who was a traitor,
who needed to be watched. The bakery, once a meeting place, was now surrounded by suspicious eyes.
The morning breeze that carried the smell of roasted wheat was no longer welcome. It awakened more memories than reality, and more anguish than consolation.
In letters from that time, we read reports of men crying in front of the oven, not because they were afraid of dying, but because they knew that what they were baking was not enough, that the bread, as soon as it came out of the oven, was already a cause for conflict. The waiting time between one batch and the next seemed like an eternity, and every minute was tense. The dough rising was like a clock counting down to the next riot, and yet they kept going,
because bread was still necessary.
It was still life, even if it was surrounded by death.
Even if you delivered it with trembling hands.
The city began to associate smells with danger. The smell of smoke could be a sign of fire or revenge. The smell of bread of provocation. The smell of blood of warning. And so, the senses began to transform.
What was once pleasurable now caused nausea.
The sense of smell went on guard, and with it, the heart.
Because they knew that, at any moment, a scent could mean the end.
Hunger had changed the perception of the world. The smell of fear became every day, and no one walked calmly in front of a bakery anymore. If this image seems strong, it's because it was.
But it's also a memory that shouldn't be forgotten.
If you can, tell me in the comments, is there a smell that transports you to a difficult time? Or that reminds you of overcoming?
I'll be here,
always,
to walk with you through these alleys of history where even the air carried tension.
Let's continue.
There are still echoes to be heard.
In Paris, there was something worse than feeling hungry. It was being blamed for it. Over time, the emptiness in the stomach stopped being just a symptom of scarcity.
It became a sign of failure,
of shame,
of moral error.
Those who begged were judged. Those who asked for food were frowned upon. The laws began to tighten,
and what had previously been shared suffering became a reason for punishment.
It was forbidden to hoard bread at home, as if fear of tomorrow were a crime.
Many were arrested for keeping 2 or 3 stale loaves of bread,
as if survival were a suspicious act.
A threat to control.
Distrust spread throughout the streets. Neighbors watched neighbors.
Children learned to hide what they ate.
Chewing in silence, eating with their backs turned. Eating became almost a secret ritual.
A quick, restrained, furtive gesture.
And with that, food gained a new meaning.
It became more than a necessity. It became a symbol of transgression.
Eating without permission was a challenge to order.
A whisper of rebellion.
As if the simple act of eating was a protest.
And for many, it was. Because when the world denies the essential, each spoonful becomes resistance.
The poorest were the most watched. There was no truce.
If they bought bread, they were questioned about the origin of the money. If they didn't buy it, they were seen as lazy.
The dilemma was cruel.
Existing while hungry was a risk.
But so was feeling full. The body could not show signs of satiety, because that would raise suspicions. Where did you come from?
Who did you share it with?
How much did you save? And so, food ceased to be public. It was taken away from the squares, from gatherings, from the fairs. Eating became an intimate act, surrounded by fear.
As if appetite needed to be hidden, charity was also repressed.
Helping could be interpreted as encouraging disorder.
For some, giving bread was an act of complicity.
The hand that offered could be punished,
as could the one that received, and little by little, gestures of solidarity withered.
Hunger became isolated,
becoming a private problem.
And society, once united by the same emptiness, fragmented.
Every man for himself.
Each dish a battle. Empathy gave way to fear.
To judgment.
To embarrassed silence in the face of other people's misery.
As if not seeing were the solution.
Those who did not resist were forgotten.
They died in alleys, wrapped in rags.
Without a name.
Without news.
Without a record. As if the lack of food erased their existence. The bodies were collected in a hurry, and no one asked.
It was dangerous to know.
It was better to look ahead, to pretend that it was an exception. That with effort, everything would work out.
That all they had to do was work harder, try harder. But behind this speech, there was only fear.
Fear that hunger was contagious.
That it would break through walls.
And remind those who had prayed how fragile their security was. The churches sometimes tried to intervene.
But even there were limits.
Fasting, once a spiritual rite, was confused with involuntary hunger.
And many preachers said that suffering was virtue, that going hungry was a path to purification. This silenced the revolt,
but it also fed the guilt.
People began to believe that they deserved that fate,
that they had sinned, that it was punishment. And so, Hunger, which had previously been pain, became punishment, a cycle of intimate suffering. That was hidden out of shame, and it grew in the darkness of the conscience. If you're still here, listening, you might feel the weight of this part, not as a lesson,
but as a reflection.
Hunger is not just biological, it's political, it's social, and when it becomes punishment, it hurts more than just the body. It hurts the eyes, the soul. If you want, tell me, have you ever seen someone being judged for being in difficulty? How did they react?
I'll be here to continue the story, to follow along.
On the trails where eating
Was dangerous. The cry of a hungry child is not the same as that of a spoiled child.
it has a hollow sound.
A thin tremor, a desperation that comes from within.
In Paris, in the days before the revolution, this sound was repeated like a sad song.
It echoed in the alleys, on the staircases, under closed windows, small, thin children, with eyes that seemed too big, not because of enchantment,
But because of hunger,
they walked barefoot, looking for something that resembled food.
sometimes they ate clay,
Mixed with leaves, other times, they licked stones to feel texture.
anything that would distract the body from the emptiness.
Mothers did what they could.
They tied cloths around their children's bellies to simulate satiety.
They sang old songs, they rocked them in their arms. But there were nights when there wasn't enough.
Hunger was not so easily fooled.
Some children remained silent, others cried themselves to sleep. And there were those who, even when they were young, learned to be quiet.
To endure, to harden, they grew up quickly, not out of maturity, but out of urgency. Childhood time was stolen, transformed into survival.
And in place of toys came tasks.
Fetching water, rummaging through scraps, taking care of younger siblings. At the fairs, some would try to steal a tomato,
A piece of fallen bread, a fruit pit.
and when caught, they were harshly reprimanded, called outcasts,
Even though they were so small,
even though their stomachs were empty,
it was as if society wanted to deny what it saw. As if punishing a starving child was easier than looking them in the eye.
and admitting the collective failure.
Some were taken away,
Arrested,
separated from their families,
others simply disappeared.
and the void they left added to so many others.
On the floor, in beds, in memories.
There were also those who tried to play.
But the game was different. It was pretending to have eaten, pretending to cook, pretending to serve meals to ragdolls. It was a silent theatre of hope and sadness mixed together. And in this game, many times, the illusion lasted longer than the body could bear.
The children invented worlds where bread was infinite,
Where milk flowed from trees,
where no one had to ask.
and these worlds, created in the mind, were more real than the cold walls of the houses, warmer than the stone floor where they slept. Malnutrition transformed bodies. Bones protruded,
Stomachs swelled.
eyes darkened. But there was something even crueler. The loss of sparkle in the eyes, that curious light, common in childhood, was extinguished, and in its place an adult emptiness appeared, a premature tiredness.
Children who no longer ran, who no longer laughed out loud, who no longer asked why. They accepted it,
And that hurt more than any crying, because it showed that hunger had already won.
that it had taken over not only the body, but also the dream.
And without dreams, childhood ceases to exist.
Some mothers would leave small pieces of bread hidden away for special occasion, a tooth that had fallen out,
A forgotten birthday.
a symbolic gesture that childhood was still alive.
Even if for a moment, even if in secret.
And when these pieces were handed out, there was silence,
The children chewed slowly,
as if they knew that this moment was rare.
sacred, and for a brief second they were just that again.
Children, without fear,
Without obligation, just small beings facing the world, with a piece of bread between their fingers. If this image touched something in you, take a deep breath. Maybe it is a distant mirror.
or a reminder of the value of simple things. If you want, share with me. What flavor reminds you of childhood?
And what would you do to protect that flavor if the world denied it? I will be here,
To listen,
to remember, to walk with you along those roads where the silence of children.
still echoes.
On the surface, Louis XVI was just another king among many. He wore a white wig, wrote with a long quill, and walked through golden corridors. But outside the walls of Versailles, something was changing.
The people, hungry, began to associate faces with pain.
And the king's face, round and distant, came to represent the greatest symbol of absence. He was not a baker. He had never held flour in his hands. He had never kneaded dough.
But for the Parisians who fasted for days, he became directly responsible for the emptiness on their plates.
It was a symbolic shortcut, an easy name to shout. The pamphlets began to circulate. Small, folded, passed from hand to hand like secrets. In them, The king was depicted next to giant loaves of bread, or seated on thrones made of wheat, sometimes eating while the people watched,
sometimes smiling before hungry lions.
The image was powerful and cruel. It made you laugh and hurt at the same time. In the cafes, jokes spread.
They said the king kept a key to the last bakery, that he used flour as talcum powder, that he fed croissants to dogs while the peasants chewed rags. The exaggeration was not innocent.
It was strategy,
a way of transforming resentment into unity. Versailles was far enough away to seem unreachable,
but stories travelled fast.
And in them, the royal kitchen took on the contours of a parallel empire.
Absolute abundance, tables that never emptied,
leftovers that would feed entire neighborhoods. The people had no proof, but they didn't need it. Hunger created certainty,
and these certainties shaped the revolt.
Every time a baker said there was no flour, someone remembered the king. Every time the price went up, someone murmured his name.
Louis XVI began to bear, even without knowing it, the weight of the denied bread.
The royal bakery was an ancient institution,
created to supply the court with the best breads, refined techniques, impeccable ovens,
hand-baked wheat.
And when this news reached the streets, it became a spark.
Why did the king deserve special bread while the people were biting the wind?
This simple and direct question spread and multiplied.
The king, silent in his chambers, may not have even known the scope of it, but it was too late.
The symbol had been formed, and symbols once lit are not easily extinguished.
They pass from voice to voice,
from gaze to gaze.
During the popular trials, bread was always present.
On the posters, in the speeches, in the questions.
It was as if the entire process of the monarchy's downfall was fermenting inside a dough.
Soft for a few,
hard for many. When Louis XVI was taken to the guillotine, some said that the sound of the cut was reminiscent of a bread knife.
And that, finally, the oven had closed.
Metaphors that seemed exaggerated, but they carried the collective pain of years of deprivation.
The king did not fall just because of political decisions.
He fell because the people were hungry. In the following years, the figure of the king continued to be associated with food. Paintings, songs, poems,
all spoke of a ruler who did not understand the taste of scarcity,
who never waited in line,
who never felt his mouth dry from waiting so long. And even after his death, Louis XVI continued to be remembered in bakeries.
As a warning, a reminder that, in times of famine, even the highest throne can fall, not by weapons, but by crumbs, and by looks that no longer accept silence.
If you reflected on this passage, you might realize how much symbols shape our perceptions, and how a simple food can become a revolution.
If you want, tell me, which symbol of the present seems unfair to you?
Which flavor carries more than flavor? I'm here, always ready to walk with you through the forgotten pages of history.
In times of crisis, the sacred tends to intertwine with everyday life. In pre-revolutionary France, this mixture took on silent and profound contour. Hunger, which was already pain, began to be interpreted as a trial, as penance, as a path to salvation.
Priests preached from cold pulpits, saying that fasting was a virtue,
that going hungry purified, and many, with no alternative, clung to these words.
Not because they believed them, but because they needed some consolation, a meaning,
a reason for so much absence. Faith, in these times, became both a foundation and a trap.
Some sermons said that Christ fasted for 40 days,
that the saints lived on little, that the weakened body drew closer to the divine.
It was hard to hear all this with a growling stomach, but there were those who believed,
and there were those who pretended.
Hunger made the body light,
the mind, at times, foggy.
And in this fog, visions appeared, feelings of guilt, thoughts of unworthiness, as if the scarcity were a punishment, an invisible punishment for forgotten sins.
And many knelt down,
asking for forgiveness. They didn't know exactly why, but they knew it hurt.
And when something hurts without explanation, one seeks an explanation in faith.
The elders remembered times when sharing was sacred, of feasts where bread was shared with joy.
But all of that seemed distant.
The churches, once refuges, became places of judgment. The altar still shone, but the pews were cold, and the gazes were hard.
Hunger had created walls between the faithful.
Those who still had something to eat sat up straighter. Those who didn't, hunched over, not out of respect,
but out of tiredness
and shame. Food became a spiritual measure, and those who were hungry also carried the weight of silence,
the fear of not being worthy of grace.
In confessions, curious stories emerged.
People asked for forgiveness for stealing a piece of bread, for being envious of their neighbor's table,
for dreaming about banquets.
The sin, in these cases, was dreaming, desiring what one could not have.
The mind was judged, appetite was tamed,
and spirituality was mixed with fear. Some children were taught that crying for food was a lack of faith. that God knew what he was doing.
That complaining was an offense, and so the sacred, which could welcome, began to oppress.
Spiritual pain added to physical pain and made everything heavier.
But there was also resistance within the faith. Priests who hid bread in the sacristy,
Nuns who offered soup in secret.
small gestures, but gigantic, because they were done with risk, with courage, and with love.
These figures did not just follow the rules of the church.
They followed the impulse of the heart.
They understood that hunger was not a fault.
It was a consequence, and that alleviating the pain of others was not heresy, it was compassion. In these parishes, bread was once again a blessing, not a punishment, and those who received it did not kneel in shame, but in gratitude. Over time, silent brotherhoods emerged, groups that, in the name of faith, organized sharing.
They collected a little from many to form enough for a few. They did not advertise. They did not show off. They just acted.
And in these gestures, faith reconnected with humanity. Hunger ceased to be a test.
It became a problem again.
And the problem, when faced with solidarity, was no longer so immense. In these communities, prayer was accompanied by a pot, prayer by a spoon, and hope by crumbs that, when put together, fed more than bodies. If this reflection touched you, perhaps it is worth remembering that spirituality does not need to deny the body,
that faith does not require suffering, that sharing bread is also a sacred right. If you want, tell me in the comments, what silent gesture of kindness have you witnessed?
I am here, in every piece of this story, in every voice that still believes that feeding is also loving. In the poorest corners of Paris, there were gestures that didn't fit into the statistic. In small houses with poorly fitted doors, a little became a lot. A thin soup was divided into 5 plates. A stale loaf of bread was sliced with more care than jewelry, and each piece offered was more than food.
It was a silent message that no one needed to be alone,
even when hungry, especially when hungry.
These rituals were not planned.
They were born of necessity,
but also of affection,
of a compassion that endured, even when the world hardened.
Some neighbors would get together at the end of the day. They would sit on the floor. One would bring an onion, another water, a third person a handful of herbs.
What was being cooked there was less important than what was being created between them. A circle, a trust, a shared hope.
Hands were extended without demand. Looks said more than words.
He didn't ask how much each person had brought.
He simply welcomed each.
And when the pot began to boil, something changed in the air.
A pleasant silence, a relief.
As if, for a moment, hunger stopped being just pain.
Children watched and learned.
Sitting on the laps of their elders, they saw that the act of giving was greater than that of receiving.
That a piece of potato could be worth more than gold. That a sip of broth could bring a smile to someone's face.
On those nights, no one gorged themselves.
But everyone slept a little warmer.
Not just because of the food, but because of the gesture.
Because of the presence. Because of the feeling of belonging. And this belonging nourished what bread could not.
The spirit, the bond.
The feeling of still being part of something greater than one's own scarcity. In some homes, codes were created.
2 knocks on the door meant an invitation to share.
3 knocks, a sign of thanks.
No one spoke loudly. Surveillance was on the lookout. But even so, the codes continued.
And in them, life went on.
A simple soup was treated as a banquet. Some would decorate the table with dried flowers. Some would light a candle, as if to say, here, there is still beauty, there is still care. Even if almost everything is missing, the ritual was not about food. It was about dignity.
About remembering that, despite the misery, there was still choice.
Some days, the pot was empty. But still, the group would get together, to talk,
to listen, to cry in silence,
or smile out of nowhere.
Because sometimes, the food was something else. It was company.
It was memory.
It was a story whispered by the fire, or a song played with fingers on the wood of the table.
And in those moments, hunger would sit with me, but it would remain quiet.
Because I knew that there, even in the midst of the pain, there was light.
Small,
but persistent, like an ember that never goes out.
Like a candle that insists, even in the face of the wind.
When someone had a little extra, they didn't save it. They knew that tomorrow could reverse the roles.
Today, the one who shares.
Tomorrow, the one who needs it. And this awareness kept the wheel turning.
It prevented hardening. It preserved tenderness.
It was as if the city, wounded, still pulsed in small gestures.
In the spoon passed from hand to hand.
In the damp cloth placed on the forehead of someone who hadn't eaten. In the piece of bread that, when shared, seemed to grow.
And perhaps it did grow.
Because love, when sincere, multiplies.
And transforms what is little into something sacred. If you're still with me, you might also be feeling this warmth, not from the fire, but from sharing.
because hearing stories like this is a reminder that, deep down, we are made of encounters. If you want, tell me in the comments, what was the simplest gesture that had a profound impact on you? I'll be here, always ready to light another candle, and to follow you through these tables of silence and affection. When reality disappears, the imaginary takes its place. In Paris, starving during the revolution, food ceased to be just matter. It became an illusion. There were people who ate without eating, who chewed wind, who served empty plates, not for show, but out of desperation. It was an attempt to deceive the body, to comfort the stomach with gesture, with sounds, with shapes. The eye saw, the mouth imitated, and the brain tried to believe. Among neighbors, recipes circulated that did not nourish, but they sustained hope. Cakes made of clay, soups with dried petals, stone broths, true banquets of fiction. On street corners, people sold food that wasn't what it seemed. Pieces of wood covered in grease, little cakes made of flour mixed with sawdust, fake cheeses molded with plaster. And even though they knew, many people bought them, because they needed to believe that there was still something to eat. It was less about the taste, more about the ritual. Having something in your hands, the smell, often artificial, was enough to trigger your memory. And memory, when properly accessed, produces heat. A brief heat, but real. A fleeting relief that helps you survive until the next day. Some even invented complete meals. In notebooks, in dreams, in words. They wrote detailed menus. They drew dishes. They made lists of impossible ingredients. It was a way of keeping the idea of abundance alive, as if the simple act of imagining was resistance. And it was, because when everything is lacking, thoughts become shelter. There were women who embroidered bread on fabric, children who molded fruits with clay, men who built stone stoves just to sit around. And in these gestures, the symbolic fed what the real denied. In the empty taverns, the theatre of the meal was created. Tables were set, plates were clean, glasses were empty, and fake laughter filled the air. To those passing by, it looked like a party, but it was a rehearsal, an attempt to remind the body of what it had forgotten, that eating could be pleasure, that existence was not just suffering. And among those who participated, no one mocked. There was respect for lies, because lies, there were a necessity, a protection, a shield against despair. Eating without eating was not giving incompletely. Others preferred silence. They sat at the empty table and closed their eyes. They took a deep breath and let their minds serve what the world could not give. A childhood memory, an old meal, a smell stored deep in their soul. And that smell was enough. For a few minutes, it was enough. It was as if the past offered what the present refused, and in the interval between one memory and another, a kind of satiety emerged, not in the body, but in the spirit, which, tired, found some rest. There were also those who used words as food, ancient lessons, prayers, poems about harvest, songs that spoke of feasts. Words, spoken with faith, created images, and images generated comfort. Even if momentary, even if fragile, it was a hunger surrounded by stories. And stories, as everyone knows, are stronger than absence. They are what remains when everything falls apart. And at that time, there was little left. But there was still a voice. There was still memory. And memory, nourished in another way. If this part of the journey made you think, maybe it's time to look fondly at everything that has sustained you, even without touch, even without taste. If you want, tell me in the comment, what memory sustains you on difficult days? I'll be here to listen, to remember with you, and to continue on this journey where even absence has flavor. Hunger doesn't just eat away at you from the inside. It draws, it sculpts, it marks the body with lines that not even time can erase. In Paris, during the years of the revolution, all you had to do was look at a silhouette to guess the story. Ribs on display, swollen bellies, legs as thin as dry twigs, and on their faces, a mixture of tiredness and resistance. Skin lost its shine, hair fell out in clumps, sunken eyes betrayed sleepless nights. There was no need to speak. The body spoke for itself. It was a silent witness to a prolonged absence, a mirror of what the world was missing. On the streets, thinness became the norm, but not the thinness worshipped in portraits of nobility. It was a crooked thinness, asymmetrical, that hurt, that limited movement, that made the simple act of getting up a difficult task. Clothes, once tight, hung on the shoulders. They were like capes from the past, remnants of a time when there was still plenty. Some tried to mend them, shrink them, disguise them, but there was no fabric that could hide the fragility. The exposed body revealed more than speech. It revealed abandonment, chronic scarcity, the effort to keep walking even without strength. Artists of the time began to portray this new aesthetic, but not with gold paint, with charcoal,
with shadows. The sketches showed mothers with withered faces,
children with bowed legs,
men hunched over, bearing more weight in their souls than in their bones.
art, once focused on ideal beauty, began to document real ugliness.
Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. You had to record what was happening,
so that it wouldn't be forgotten, so that, in the future, someone would look and understand what hunger had done to those bodies. In some neighborhoods, an involuntary fashion was created.
The thin body became common, and those who still had some fat attracted attention. They were viewed with suspicion, as if it were a sign of privilege
or of betrayal. So, many tried to appear even thinner. They walked hunched over. They hid their faces. They adapted their gestures.
Body language changed.
It became restrained,
Economical, as if even movement needed to be spared. Arms no longer opened lightly. Steps were short,
and hugs were rare, because hugging required energy.
and energy was a luxury. The gaze also changed. Previously vibrant, it became observant, on guard. People looked at others as if they were measuring distances. They evaluated.
They compared.
They were trying to understand whether that body was more or less fragile than theirs. And in this game of looks, fear grew.
The fear of falling faster,
Of not being able to resist.
of slowly disappearing.
Without a name, without a record, without a memory, the body stopped being a shelter and became a burden.
Something that needed to be carried, maintained,
Even if with a minimum.
even if it hurt with every step.
But there was also beauty in this suffering. Not aesthetic beauty, but the beauty of persistence, of the gesture that continues,
Of the hand that reaches out, even if weak. Of the shy smile that appears, even without reason.
the body, even exhausted, was still capable of loving, of caring,
Of singing. And that was a miracle,
a silent miracle,
repeated every day,
with every breath.
with every beat of the insistent heart. And this insistence in itself was a form of beauty. A beauty that cannot be seen in the mirror, but can be felt, like warmth that springs from deep within the chest. If you felt your own body react when you heard this, perhaps it reminds you of something, of a difficult time, of overcoming a challenge, of an invisible scar. If you want, tell me, what has your body faced in silence?
What stories does it keep without words? I will be here,
To listen, to stay with you.
until your body can finally rest without fear.
History often speaks of ideas, treaties, and impassioned speeches.
But the French Revolution, at its core, was born in the stomach. It was not just about freedom.
Nor just about equality.
It was about bread.
The lack of it.
The long waits in cold lines. The cries of children at dawn.
The empty pots that echoed like war drums. Books often forget.
But the alleys, the squares, the silent kitchens remember. The revolt did not spring from the salons.
It sprang from hunger.
From a hole that opened in the center of the body and grew until it became a clamor.
The people did not shout out difficult words.
They shouted out the names of bakers,
Of nobles.
of tax collectors. They shouted out for flour.
For access. For respect.
Each step towards the Bastille carried the weight of days without chewing. The guillotine, symbol of the fall, was also a symbol of waiting.
Because those who waited for bread and did not receive it no longer had the patience to listen to promises.
The time for politics was over.
The time for instinct remained. And instinct said, enough. It was as if every empty belly was knocking on the king's door.
And this knocking did not ask permission.
In the popular meetings, the agenda was clear. They did not talk about philosophy. They talked about bread, how to get it, how to protect it, how to distribute it. And even the most literate learned that without food, no idea flourishes.
The body, when neglected, turns any theory into noise. That is why the leaders who emerged from the people spoke simply,
With words that fit in the mouths of those who did not eat. And this direct language, fed by real experience, gained strength.
a strength that did not come from reason, but from survival.
The barricades that were erected were not made only of wood. They were made of fatigue,
Of anger,
of broken hopes. They were built by hands that had already asked for too much, and now decided to take.
not out of greed, but out of necessity. When food becomes an object of negotiation, people learn to negotiate with the impossible. And the impossible, at that time, was to remain silent.
Thus, the walls began to fall,
Not just the physical ones,
but the invisible ones.
those that separated the palace from the outskirts,
Wealth from poverty.
the farce from reality. In popular songs, the chorus was repeated,
Bread, 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 like a mantra,
like a call.
like a dry-mouthed prayer. The voices united,
And even without harmony, there was beauty.
because there was the heart of the movement.
Not in the papers, but in the voices, in the calloused hands, in the deep-set eyes.
In the tears that fell without shame.
Each song was also a request, a warning, An act of faith that, if they sang loud enough, someone would hear and maybe respond with a basket of wheat, with a piece of cheese, with the dignity that was so lacking. When the Bastille finally fell, there was silence. A silence that was not one of celebration, but of exhaustion, like someone who reaches the end of the line and no longer finds what they were looking for. But even so, they smiled.
Because the fall of the tower did not guarantee bread.
But it guaranteed listening. The people had been heard, and that, in itself, was nourishment.
For the ego.
For the soul. For history. The revolution had begun long before.
In cold kitchens.
In empty hands. In waiting.
Now, it was gaining a name. A face.
And time.
And even though the hunger had not ended, there was a breath of hope. If you felt the weight and power of this moment, you might realize how small absences can turn into big changes. If you want, tell me, what have you ever missed to the point of changing everything?
I will be here.
To listen.
To walk with you.
Where words meet the silence of the belly.
And silence, with the strength of a people who, even with an empty stomach, rose up.
On the eve of death, even bread changes its taste.
In the prisons of the revolution, last dinners were more than just meals. They were rituals.
The end of a story.
A farewell whispered between slow bites. There were those who refused to eat, those who could not swallow, those who laughed nervously in front of the plate.
And there were those who chewed reverently, as if each bite were a prayer.
A farewell to the world of the living.
Food in those moments stopped being physical. It became a symbol.
A silent pact between memory and oblivion. Some asked for dishes from their childhood.
A soup made like grandma's. A piece of cheese that smelled just like their hometown.
Others asked for the simplest things. A loaf of bread. A glass of wine.
As if, when faced with the end, less was more. As if the flavors wanted to return to the beginning, to the first taste,
to the first consolation. And there were also those who asked for a lot. A feast. Not out of hunger,
but out of challenge.
Out of pride.
Because they wanted to take as many memories with them as possible.
Even knowing that, in a few hours, their bodies would no longer matter.
The jailers watched in silence. They knew that, at that moment, there was no hierarchy. That food united everyone in the same human condition.
Some touched offered an extra piece.
A calmer look. A spoon served with care.
Because death, even if habitual, did not stop weighing on them, even for those who saw it every day. And in that moment of surrender, silence was the law. The sounds of the cutlery, the slight gurgle of the liquid, the deep breath between one mouthful and the next.
It was as if time slowed down.
As if the world was waiting for the last sip. Outside, people imagined these dinners with curiosity. They created stories.
They invented menus. They said that the nobles ate delicacies.
That the traitors ate alone. That some sang.
That others cried. The truth, however, was simpler. More human. Not everyone ate, but everyone felt. And what was felt was heavy.
It was dense.
It could not be put into words.
It fit into closed mouths, in eyes fixed on the table,
in hands that trembled as they held the bread. Because eating knowing the end is a strange exercise.
Of acceptance, of surrender.
For those who were on the right side of history, the supper of the damned was just a detail, a footnote in the books. But for those who lived it, for those who were there, the dinner was everything.
It was a stage, a confession,
a final pleasure, a final gesture of control.
Because while you eat, you still choose.
You still chew. You still breathe.
And in that interval between the bite and nothingness, there is life. A life that insists, that resists,
that wants to be felt until the last second.
And that, as dark as it may seem, is beautiful.
It is profoundly human. After the last bite, there was silence.
Some wrote letters. Others remained still. The meal settled in the stomach like a stone or like tenderness.
It depended on what was served.
And how it was received. Some remembered, others forgot. But the body, that one, kept.
Every flavor, every aroma,
every crumb, as if it wanted to take a little bit of the world with it.
A little bit of the earth, a little bit of you,
wherever it went. Even if there was nowhere else to go. Even if tomorrow never came. If this image moved you, perhaps you understand the value of what we put on the table. Not just as food, but as history.
As a gesture.
As a memory.
If you want, tell me, what was the most symbolic meal of your life?
I'm still here.
Ready to listen.
To serve.
To be by your side. Until the last word.
In France, bread is more than just food. It is identity. Symbol.
Memory. Visitors to the country feel it on street corners. In bakeries that open early.
In the warm smell that escapes through the doors. In the silent lines in front of the counters.
And even though the time of famine seems distant, it lives there.
In each golden crust.
In each soft crumb.
Bread tells a story.
Of scarcity.
Of revolt. of survival,
of a time when each bite was a conquest.
and this memory, even if unspoken, remains. It whispers in everyday life, in recipes, in the almost sacred respect for wheat. The French treat bread with a reverence that borders on ritual. It is not thrown away. It is not wasted.
Stale bread is turned into toast.
Pudding, French toast. Nothing is wasted.
Because to lose would be to forget.
And to forget would be to betray.
There are ancient gestures that persist.
Making the sign of the cross on the base of the bread before cutting it.
Keeping the last piece carefully.
Sharing the first with someone you love.
These are small acts that seem simple, but they carry centuries of meaning.
As if each slice still needs to be honored.
As if there is still, deep down, the fear that one day it will be gone again.
In schools, bread is included in snacks, on meeting tables, at breakfasts with friends.
It marks meeting. It brings generations together.
Children learn early on to recognize good bread,
To differentiate between types of flour.
to smell the aroma and understand if it is fresh. This is not vanity. It is culture. It is tradition, a knowledge transmitted in silence.
As if, when learning about bread, one also learned about belonging, about what unites.
About what sustains. And this learning happens without fanfare, like dough that rises while resting, in its own time,
At its own pace.
French cuisine, famous throughout the world, has bread as its foundation. It goes well with cheeses.
It balances wines.
It serves as the base for sophisticated or simple dishes.
But in all contexts, it maintains its dignity.
It is not an adornment. It is the center.
And this has its roots in the past,
Back in the days when the absence of bread was synonymous with disorder,
with despair.
with death. Today, when we put a baguette in our bag, the gesture may seem commonplace. But for those who know the history, it is a reminder of everything that has been lost.
And of everything that was necessary for it to be there. Warm and accessible. At popular festivals, bread appears as an offering.
As a symbol of abundance. At weddings, baptisms, seasonal celebrations, it is always present. As if to say, we are alive.
We are together. We have something to eat.
And this silent presence is powerful because it conveys what words cannot reach. Bread carries within itself an ancestral heritage, a collective memory that does not need to be taught.
It manifests itself in the care taken with the oven.
In the respect for the baker, in the pleasure of tearing a piece with your hands and offering it without rushing. Even in modern protests, bread still appears, on posters, in chants, in metaphors, because it continues to be the measure
Of what is fair.
of what is essential.
Of what cannot be lacking.
And when it is lacking,
The echo of the revolution reappears.
on the streets, in speeches, in looks, as if the country were saying, once again, we will not starve in silence. We will not accept absence as normal. Bread, in this sense, is also a vigilante, a guardian of time.
A guardian of dignity. Of what is minimal and sacred at the same time.
If you've ever held a piece of bread and not thought much about it, that's okay.
But now that you know this story, maybe you look at it different.
Maybe you feel the gentle weight of an old memory.
And if you want, tell me, what food reminds you of who you are?
Where did you come from? I'm still here, with the table set, with the oven lit, waiting for the next piece of the story.
Close your eyes if you like.
Take a deep breath.
Imagine waking up on a grey morning in Paris in the year 1789.
The bed is made of straw. The floor is cold stone. All around you, the air smells of dust and absence. Your stomach hurts, not of illness, but of emptiness. You hear footsteps outside, people talking softly, as if fear also had a voice. The sky seems lower today, and the day, longer before it even begins. You get up slowly,
Every movement requires effort.
and the first question that arises is not what to wear.
It is whether there will be food.
In the corner of the house, there is a stale piece of bread.
You look at it.
You evaluate it, but you decide to keep it.
You don't know what the night will be like, or the next day. Your gaze meets that of a younger brother, or perhaps an elderly neighbor, and you offer half, because even in times of scarcity, there are gestures that cannot be explained. They just happen.
You go out.
You go to the street,
The stones on the path hurt your feet.
but there are worse things.
The line in front of the bakery is one of them. Long, silent, people holding coins as if they were hope.
Or a sentence.
You join them, and wait. As you wait, your thoughts wander. You remember the smell of fresh bread one day, the taste of the onion soup your mother made, the laughter at the table, when there was a table.
Now, what remains are memories that warm you more than your body itself.
Someone shouts. The line gets busy.
They say the bread is gone, or that the price has gone up.
Or that a soldier has taken it all. You look around.
You see sunken eyes, clenched fists.
And you realize that, in that moment, everything can change.
Because hunger is also a spark.
And when it joins others, it turns into fire. You have to decide. Stay and wait longer? Shout. Run? Beg?
Steal.
The city is a tense chessboard. Each step can be a choice. Each choice, a consequence.
You think about going back.
But the path seems longer now. Your body is heavy. Your heart is too.
You see a group talking about marching,
About taking. About changing. And you feel afraid.
but you also feel something new.
A strength that comes from within.
Not from courage,
But from tiredness.
from not wanting to accept anymore, from wanting to be heard, and heard not with applause, but with bread. If you had to decide now, what would you do? Would you stay quiet to protect your loved ones?
Or would you speak, even if no one was listening?
Would you take what little was left for yourself?
Or would you share it, even if you didn't have it?
And if all of this were you,
Not as a character,
but as flesh,
both, hunger, desire, what would you choose?
there is no right answer, no fixed script,
There is only doubt. And doubt, in this context, is the only certainty.
because human beings, when confronted with absolute absence, reveal layers that not even they knew.
Come back slowly. Breathe again.
Feel your feet on the ground,
Your hand, perhaps, touching a real table.
food nearby.
A roof over your head. You are not in 1789.
But this inner journey has taken you
And now that you have returned, perhaps you will see the present with different eyes.
more attentive,
More grateful, more careful.
because imagining is also remembering.
And remembering is a way of honoring those who came before, those who survived.
Those who could not tell their story, but left signs of it along the way.
If this exercise touched you, tell me,
How did you feel when you were there?
what decision would you have made?
And what, from the past, reverberates in your present?
I'm still here, with my feet in history.
And my eyes turn to you, ready to continue this journey together. There is a kind of silence that cannot be heard, but can be felt. It does not come from books, nor from squares, nor from impassioned speeches. It comes from within, from the stomach that slowly twists, from the mouth that closes because it has nothing to chew.
This silence accompanied the French Revolution like a shadow. While the cannons echoed and the pamphlets multiplied, it was still there, invisible but present. It was what united the anonymous, what drove mothers into the streets, what made bread a symbol and its absence a cry. Hunger doesn't just leave marks on the body.
It leaves marks on the memory, on gestures, on smells that remain engraved, on choices that become reflections.
And even when it passes, the echo remains, in the form of fear, in the form of care, in the form of respect for what one has. The history of the revolution is also the history of these echoes.
Of faces that were not portrayed, of empty pots that boiled dreams, of small steps that turned into marches, and of a city that had to learn to speak on an empty stomach. Today, when we look back, we can try to understand, but we will never feel completely, because there are things that only the body knows, only time reveals, only silence translates.
Even so, trying is necessary.
Because it is in trying that empathy lives, and it is in empathy that care begins, caring for memory,
For food,
for others.
for the present that only exists because someone in the past resisted. The story we tell here is not made of heroes with swords,
It is made of ordinary people who survived,
who shared.
who dreamed even with their eyes sunken. If you've come this far, you may feel something strange in your chest, a mixture of tenderness, sadness, and gratitude,
This is a sign that the story has touched you.
that it didn't pass through you like the wind, but like a whisper. And this whisper tells you that there is still something to remember, that there is still something to tell.
That hunger, even ancient, still teaches us about limits,
About humanity,
about strength,
and about the immense value of a simple dish, of a gesture of sharing.
of attentive listening.
Revolutions do not end with treaties, they continue in silence,
In the way we look at those who have less, in the care we take of the bread that is left over.
in the respect we give to those who no longer have the strength to beg.
This is the revolution that matters now, the one we make in our daily lives,
With open eyes,
with willing hands.
with welcoming words, and with ears attentive to the silences that still echo. If this story touched you, well, there are many others that echo like this one. Stories that are not in books, but that survive in gesture, in smells, in sound,
And I will be here, whispering these stories in your dreams,
so that you never forget, so that you never go to sleep hungry,
not for food.
not for history, not for humanity.
Now, if you wish, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let this story rest inside you, like someone keeping a warm loaf of bread in their pocket, to remind themselves